Hi everyone, this is Professor Hein Nguyen, and I want to welcome you to my tutorial video for your first exam, right? In this video, I'm going to try to explain to you the test format and ultimately the themes and the concept that you should somewhat focus on as part of your preparation. And ultimately, I'm just going to try to give you a brief somewhat analysis or at least a brief preview of what each document is about and ultimately how you should somewhat use it as part of your consider it as part of your preparation. So let's just do a quick recap is that so far in the class from module 1 through 4 and chapter 10 through 15, what we have somewhat covered in American history really starts with somewhat in the year 1800, right? You have in the year 1800 a very important crucial election in American history with Thomas Jefferson. We somewhat call it the Jeffersonian era. You have the election of Thomas Jefferson, but also somewhat the beginning of American democracy in a sense was that Thomas Jefferson really tried to somewhat presents himself as a man of the commoners, right? In particular, of the ordinary man. So you start off with the election of Thomas Jefferson, and then ultimately we expand with Western expansion with the Louisiana Purchase, and then ultimately you have the War of 1812 that really solidifies somewhat America's independence from the British, right? 1812, the British somewhat tried to recolonize the Americans the second time as part of somewhat from the first time from the American Revolution. So by 1815, you have an end to the war, and as a result, it really solidifies somewhat America's somewhat status and position, and somewhat allows it to somewhat focus on itself domestically. And as a result, that is why you have somewhat the market revolution, this incredible series of economic changes. You have the canal system, you have somewhat the building of roads, you have the beginning of the railroad system that really facilitate trade. And as a result, you have this economy booming after 1815 into the 1850s. And by the 1830s as well, you are going to have somewhat the once again, the rise of American democracy with Andrew Jackson. Once again, we call it Jacksonian democracy because, again, Andrew Jackson really tried to present himself as a champion, as somewhat a man of the people, right? The everyday commoners, if you will. And by the 1830s, because of somewhat the controversial election of 1824, by 1828, you have the election of Andrew Jackson, where you also have the establishment, or I'm sorry, the solidification of the two-party political party system was that by the 1830s, no longer were political parties seen as a negative or as a bad, but by the 1830s, because of the Democrats and a response to the Democrats, who were the Whigs, by 1840, you have the somewhat establishment of the two-party system, right? These are the two main political parties that Americans will somewhat divide themselves along the line of. But by 1840, those political parties somewhat cross regional lines, right? You can be a Northern Whig, a Southern Whig, you can be a Northern Democrat and a Southern Democrat. It's simply because the issue that really brings people together was not somewhat their division over slavery, but more so about somewhat their views of government and its role in the economy in particular, and also over the issue of banking. So 1840, you have the two political party system really solidifying itself, but unfortunately, the two-party system itself is going to be put to a test. And as a result, because of the expansion of slavery, starting with the Mexican-American War in 1848, you have the issue of slavery, what was once a moral issue, because of the abolitionists. Now, because of the expansion into the Deep South and into somewhat the Southwest, what you have is slavery itself becomes somewhat a political issue. And as a result, Americans were divided over the topic of expansion of slavery. And as a result, the two-party system itself becomes somewhat more of a regional, somewhat representation of America, meaning that your politics depends on somewhat where you live, whether that's in the North or in the South, and your politics is dictated on your perception or your position on over the issue of slavery. And as a result, by the 1850s, because of the expansion of slavery itself, slavery becomes a political issue. It divides America along regional line, free labor to the North under the Republicans, and ultimately in the South, you have the Democrats who were somewhat pro-slavery expansion. And as a result, by 1860, you have the election of Abraham Lincoln that really caused somewhat Southerners to secede from the Union. And as a result, you have the Civil War, right? So that somewhat recaps somewhat the history that you have examined from the year 1800 with the election of President Jefferson, right? Really the beginning of American democracy. Then you get to 1830s, you have somewhat, again, proliferation, a continuation of that democracy with Andrew Jackson, the rise of the two-party system itself. But unfortunately, because of the issue over slavery and its expansion, the two-party system itself collapsed. It divides along regional line, and by 1860, the South seceded from the Union simply because they were trying to preserve slavery as an institution and as part of their economy. So that's somewhat a recap of the history that we have covered in this course. And I hope you somewhat enjoy the activities that I had you do from module 1 through 4, right? I asked you to somewhat analyze the two-party system itself, and we try to use hindsight into foresight, right? That's why I asked you to somewhat think about somewhat the election of going on today, whether it's good or bad that American voters really only have two parties to choose from, right? That you only have the Democrats and the Republicans. And oftentimes Americans, we complain that, oh, you know, we only get two choices. We wish we had more choices, right? But if this upcoming election in 2020 and also the last somewhat presidential election in 2016, what it has showed us is that you might want to be careful what you wish for, is that even though you only have two parties, if you will, there was a wide range of candidates. I think in 2016, we had over somewhat 15 nominations, right? Nominee for the presidency from the Republican side. Granted that a lot of them were white, right? With the exception of somewhat Ben Carson, if you will. And also by 2020, you see the Democrats, even though it's a little bit more diverse, you had 20 candidates on the stage, and it just became a headache from all American voters, because again, when you want more choices, guys, that means you have to invest more time, right, to somewhat learn about these candidates. And unfortunately, lives are busy. And look, ain't nobody got time to be looking up 20 candidates, right? So what it comes down to is that the two-party system, it has its benefits and also it has its drawback, right? So I hope you somewhat enjoy that. In module number 2, right, I asked you to somewhat examine the arguments for slavery from the Southern perspective, and also the arguments somewhat against slavery from primarily African Americans themselves, like Frederick Douglass, right, and others. So in somewhat module number 2, I asked you to look at the arguments for and against slavery, to look at how the South tried to justify slavery under the veil of Christianity, under the veil of somewhat, it's a positive good, right? It benefits the slave, but look, guys, we know better. Right, we know better is that it's probably more accurate to get somewhat what slavery was like from somewhat slaves themselves, right? So as a result, I try to get you to understand, right, the different arguments and somewhat the different perspectives in terms of how slave masters and also the slaves themselves view the system of slavery. And speaking of slavery, in module number 3, I know it was somewhat kind of a boring module, if you will, because I asked you to read a lot of the secession somewhat statement from Southern states as they try to explain why they decided to secede from the Union. And I know it was somewhat a boring exercise, if you will, but the reason that I had you somewhat read those secession statement, it's simply because in history, we want to use evidence as somewhat or source, right? We want to read from the writing of the people themselves, right? To see what their perspective were and what their explanation was. Again, we want to go straight to the horse's mouth, right? To get it directly from the source. And as a result, That's why that's why I had you read the secession statement, because I think there's a confusion today that a lot of Americans, or certain segment of America, particularly those in the South in particular, still cling on to this idea that the Civil War itself was a matter of states' rights, that somewhat the Confederate soldiers were really patriots and they were fighting somewhat to defend the Constitution, that slavery had nothing to do with it, and that ultimately what the Civil War was about was a matter of states' rights and defending the Constitution, right? That's what the people, or that's what certain segment of Americans today have in terms of how they understand what the Civil War was about. But I hope it's been clear to you that if you read those secession statements, right, the leaders of the Confederacy makes it quite clear what the Civil War was about, right? That, guys, it was about slavery. And anybody that tells you otherwise is lying to you, because again, historians were very much like scientists, except our science is really in the social science, right? But we still are like scientists. We let our evidence, right, dictate our conclusion. And if you read those secession statement very clearly, Confederate states, leaders, right, and even the vice president of the Confederacy make it very clear that what the Civil War was about, it was about preserving slavery, okay? States' rights was simply a means to an end, meaning that ultimately Southerners used the argument of states' rights to justify, right, slavery, right? It's a means to an end. At the end of the day, their end goal is to preserve slavery and to make sure that it continued to expand. So anybody tells you, oh, the Civil War was about states' rights, you might want to ask them, well, states' rights to do what? And you also might want to ask them, have you ever read somewhat the secession statements from Southern states before? Because they make it quite clear, right, to the reader and also to the American public what the Civil War was about. So that was the reason why I had you somewhat analyze the secession statements from Southern states, because again, I know it was kind of boring, but I think it's also very informative, and it's crucial that you understand what the Civil War was really about and not buy into somewhat this BS argument that the Civil War was somehow about states' rights and not about slavery. No, it's about both, right? And states' right is a means to an end. States' rights allow Southerners to preserve slavery. So as a result, that's why I had you looking at somewhat the secession statement. And of course, in module number 4, I had you somewhat analyze somewhat the legacy of the Confederacy, right? That why is it that you still have many Americans today celebrating the Confederacy, right? And celebrating Confederacy as part of their heritage, celebrating the Confederacy as ultimately as American, when really the Confederacy was about anything but American, because we have to remember that Southern states were ultimately traitors. Southern states were the rebels here, guys, was that what they did was that they decided to leave America. But yet somehow, some reason, yet today you have millions of Americans believing that the Confederacy should be celebrated. And the question becomes, what are we celebrating the Confederacy for? Yes, it is a part of history, but ultimately society has changed. And ultimately, why do public spaces where you have more and more people of color, right, using these public spaces, you still have statues that celebrate somewhat white supremacy, right? In an America where eventually soon white Americans will be the minority, if you will, right? Why do we still have monuments, statues, and ultimately roads and cities named after Confederate monuments? So module number 4, I asked you to look at the Confederacy and ultimately its legacy. And I promise you this will not be the last time we are going to look at somewhat the legacy of the Confederacy. So that's a quick recap in terms of what you have learned in this class so far, what I have asked you to do in module 1 through 4, and ultimately, this is where we get to somewhat our first exam, okay? Because what you have been doing in those modules assignment, module 1 through 4, they are skills that you are going to need in order for you to be successful on the first midterm. And what I mean by that is that it's simple. Your first exam is what we call a document-based question exam. So here's where I want to share my screen with you. So that way you can see what the heck I'm talking about, okay? So All right, so if you go to somewhat midterm number one, right, it's a module of its own. And if you go there, basically what you're going to see are the instructions for the exam, what we are going to cover, and also the format of the test. Now, what I'm hoping is that what you have done so far from module 1 through 4 will help you sharpen and practice the skills that are going to be needed for you to be successful on the exam. Because the only difference between the exam and what you have been doing so far in the module assignment is simply time. That is it. Because what you are going to have is you are going to have a 2-week window to prepare for the exam. And I do want to make this a warning is that, guys, the midterm is not designed for you to complete last minute. So this assignment, you should not be somewhat opening this assignment and start working this assignment on the day of when this assignment is due or even the day before. I promise you, this is going to take you a lot of time because it's going to require you to track change over time. It is not going to just limit on a single chapter or a single issue, but this is going to require you to look at American history from multiple time periods and also from multiple perspectives. I can tell you that right now, that in this exam, I am going to ask you to look at American history from the year 1800 all the way up to the year 1860. And I'm going to ask you to look at American history from 4 different lenses, okay? White men, women, African American slaves, and Native Americans. So those are the 4 groups that you might want to start thinking about in terms of what their life was like, what their experience was like, starting from the year 1800 and all the way up to the year 1860, okay? So those are somewhat the perspective that you are going to have to analyze and present itself. But getting back to the topic at hand is that I'm hoping that the modules have prepared you with the skills that you're gonna need, right? To analyze primary and secondary sources. And using those sources, right, to answer a question that I am posing for this assignment. It's very similar, guys. But the only difference is that this time around, for the exam, you have a 2-week window to prepare. The difference is you don't know the question that I'm going to ask you, but in this video, I'm going to try my best to give you as much hint and clues as much as possible in terms of what the test is going to be about. Okay, I already told you, it's going to require you to analyze history from 4 perspectives. White men, women, you can say white women, that's fine, right? African-American slaves, and ultimately Native Americans. Those are the 4 groups, 1800 to 1860, okay? So the only difference between the exam and the module assignment is that you're going to have a 2-week window to prepare. You don't know the question that I'm going to ask you. And then on top of that, instead of a 2-week period for you to somewhat type up your response, I'm going to put you under pressure. I'm going to put you under a time limit of 2 hours. The moment when you hit the start quiz button, the clock starts, guys. And again, you're not going to get multiple tries for this, not like you had in the module quizzes. You're only going to get 1 attempt. So you better make sure that you're setting aside as much time as possible for you to prepare and understand as much history as you can, okay, in terms of those 4 groups of people and the time period that we're focusing on. So that way, when you start the quiz, you're under the clock. You got 2 hours. But I do want to say this, guys, if you are prepared, okay, 2 hours is plenty of time, okay, to write a cohesive essay. Because I promise you, by the end of this video and by the time that you start the quiz, when you see the question, you will not be shocked at the question that I am asking you to answer, okay? So you don't know the question, and then on top of that, I'm gonna put you under the pressure 2 hours. You gotta write a cohesive essay in a matter of 2 hours. And we're talking about essay, guys. We are talking about a standard, somewhat essay college essay. Introduction, followed by a thesis statement in the introduction, laying out your argument, summarizing your argument, right? And then ultimately you're gonna have body paragraphs that supports your thesis, and your body paragraphs need to have a topic sentence, it needs to have evidence, and it needs to have an analysis in terms of why the evidence you presented answers the question that is being asked. And of course, last but not least, a conclusion where you ultimately wrap up your ideas, okay, and you somewhat re-summarize your argument once again. That's how it's going to work, guys. So yes, this is a really hard task that you have to do. And this is why I say you need to set as much time as possible, because again, the skills that are required to complete this task, you have been somewhat doing in the modules assignment. But the only difference is you have a 2-hour window to complete the test, okay? And you also have to write an essay, okay? So that's what it's about, guys, okay? And what I'm also hoping is that now you are familiar with what the document-based question exam is. I had you somewhat analyze and grade yourself, right? The sample DBQ assignment. And the sample DBQ assignment was very simple to familiarize you with the test format. If you're still not familiar, I have a link right down below on this page that will explain to you, again, what a DBQ is, how to read and analyze somewhat primary resources, okay? How to cite and properly, how to quote and cite from the sources. So I have all of those resources available for you down below. So I'm not gonna spend time in this video wasting time to explain to you what a DBQ is, how to read primary resources, how to cite from the text, because you have all those resources, guys. So please make sure that you are reviewing those sources, so that way you understand what this test is about. And again, do not wait last minute to work on this assignment, okay, guys? So with that said, you already know what the test format is about, okay? You already know what the criteria is, right? 2-hour window, and you wanna make sure that you have strong internet connection. You are not distracted by anything else that's going on around you, because again, guys, when that clock starts, that's all you're gonna have, okay? But you wanna make sure that you utilize the entire 2-hour window, okay? Because if you end your test early, and if I read your test and I find a lot of grammatical errors, I find ideas that are undeveloped, I find misspellings or anything that nature, right? I'm gonna hold that against you. Because simply, again, I give you 2 hours, I expect you to use the 2 hours to do everything that you can to make sure that you present your best foot and work forward, okay? So 2 hour, and also on top of that, you need to type out an essay that is at least 1,000 words, and that will utilize at least 6 out of the 8 documents that I'm assigning, and also using all of the key terms to help you tell a comprehensive story, okay? Or a comprehensive somewhat understanding of American history. So that's what this test is about, guys. Those are the criteria. So I'm hoping that you understand what the test format is, right? What you need to somewhat do in terms of your writing, in terms of the requirement. So here's where I want to just jump into the themes and concept that you should be paying attention to as somewhat part of your preparation. So for your midterm, I am using a speech that Frederick Douglass, the famous Frederick Douglass, the great orator, the great somewhat African-American civil rights leader in the 1960s, in the 1850s, if you will. So Frederick Douglass was invited to speak in England. He's on a world tour, if you will, and he's in England, and he is asked to speak to somewhat the British audience. And in his farewell speech to somewhat his British audience, if you will, he makes this claim that ultimately America is a nation of inconsistency, okay? Now, I have provided you the link to Frederick Douglass' speech. If you want to read the entire thing, you're more than welcome to, okay? Because Frederick Douglass, in his speech, he lays out his argument. He says, here are the reasons why America is a nation of inconsistency, okay? Now, I want to be clear on this. This exam is not about Frederick Douglass's speech and what it is about, okay? So in your essay, I am purely using Frederick Douglass's speech as an idea, as a concept. I want to see, do you understand why Frederick Douglass would make such a claim with consideration for the history of America from the year 1800 to the year 1860? Okay? Why would Frederick Douglass claim that America is a nation of inconsistency? not based on the argument that he lays out, because he will talk about why America is a nation of inconsistency. And it gets really somewhat technical. It gets really technical. So again, guys, midterm number one is not about you analyzing Frederick Douglass's speech in detail, okay? We are purely using Frederick Douglass's claim, right, as somewhat an idea, okay? And we want to put his idea to the test when we consider the history of America from 1800 to 1860. What does that mean, that America is a nation of inconsistency? And that is where I'm letting you know right now, in order for you to answer that question, is America a nation of inconsistency? You are going to have to analyze American history from the year 1800 to the year 1860 from 4 different perspectives: white men, white women, African American slaves, and Native Americans. Because if you look at the 4 experiences, those 4 experiences, you can clearly see that some of them are winners, meaning that their freedom expanded, okay? Rights were expanded, their liberty were expanded, that they benefited from this time period. But you can also see that there are somewhat losers. That's what it is, guys. There are winners and losers, right? And in this time period, those 2 things are correlated. How some people benefit is at the expense of others. And that's what it's about, okay? So I hope that you understand. I can't give you the question, but I can tell you right now, the theme we are focusing on midterm number one is Frederick Douglass's claim that America is a nation of inconsistency. And your task is to figure out, okay, how. And how you explain that, okay, how America is a nation of inconsistency, you have to look at the experiences of the people, of the groups of people that live at that time. White men, white women, African Americans, right? And Native Americans. You can clearly see that there's an inconsistency, because you got to think about what this nation is founded upon, right? Ideas that all men are created equal, that we have natural rights, freedom, equality, liberty. That's what this nation is founded upon. Now, what you want to figure out is, did America live up to those ideals? And that's what this test is going to be about, guys. So I can't give it more than that. So let's dive in into somewhat the documents, if you will. All right, so document number one. Document number one, it's exactly what it reads, right? It's the inauguration of President Jackson. We're talking about Andrew Jackson. And I'm assigning to you this document. It's a fabulous document because it gives you an eyewitness account of what it was like to be there on the day that Andrew Jackson was inaugurated. A party is an understatement. So you might want to read somewhat the chaotic scene that was described by an eyewitness, somewhat who attended the inauguration. But the bigger question you need to ask yourself is, why was the scene so chaotic? That why did thousands of people all across America came to witness somewhat this man's inauguration? That is the bigger question that you need to ask yourself in terms of document number one. Because not only do you need to summarize the document, but you need to explain and somewhat extrapolate why this document helps you answer the question. And again, why Andrew Jackson? The answer lies is he's important in American history. Guys, Andrew Jackson is one of the few presidents in American history that will have a time period named after himself, right? We call it Jacksonian democracy. Now, what you might want to do is think about relevant information to go along with this document, right? Andrew Jackson, his inauguration, what it represents in terms of American politics. Think about the people who voted for him, right? And think about how his inauguration changed how American politics worked. who became somewhat eligible voters, right? Whose rights were expanded to allow them to participate to elect him. And why do we call Andrew Jackson's somewhat presidency Jacksonian democracy? The key word there, guys, is democracy. So you might want to figure out what Andrew Jackson's somewhat presidency, right? How it relates to somewhat those four various groups, right? Think about who benefited from his inauguration, and think about people who were somewhat negatively impacted by his inauguration. And I'm pretty sure you will find out who are the winners and who are the losers really quickly. So I'm not going to dive too much into document number one, because again, I don't want to give away too much information. All right, document number two, speaking of winners and losers, okay? So here was a speech that Andrew Jackson, once again, Andrew Jackson makes, right, to Congress in 1830, and guys, it's right there in the title, okay? His speech is about Indian removal. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to explain to Congress and also to the American people why Indians need to be removed. So this is ultimately a somewhat two-point connection. You might want to think about why he wanted to remove the Native Americans, how that impacted them, and if the Native Americans are removed, who is going to benefit from that? That is where you might want to think about it. So again, I'm not going to dive too deep into it, but document number two is very self-explanatory, right? I'm asking you to think about Andrew Jackson, but I'm also asking you to think about somewhat how it relates to Native Americans, because again, we're trying to look at history from those different lenses, if you will, okay? So document number two, yeah, it's about Native Americans, but more so than just Native Americans. Think about what happened once Andrew Jackson gets his wish. Native Americans are removed. Think about who benefited from that removal, okay? That's where you might want to think about that, okay? So document number three. All right, document number three, Declaration of Sentiments. 1848, you have more than 300 somewhat women, predominantly white women. You also have some men as well joining in. 1848, this is in Seneca Falls. You have women coming together, trying to somewhat make an argument that they deserve the right to vote. This is the beginning of what we call women's suffrage, guys. But this Declaration of a Sentiment, if you look at it, it really reminiscent. It is really an echoing of the Declaration of Independence. What women were making an argument for is that this country, right, was founded on those democratic ideals, that all men are created equal. But the problem was America was not populated by just men. There were also women. Women contributed to society. Women participated in society. They are half of the population, but yet those ideals that were founded back in 1776 did not apply to them. So the Declaration of Sentiment was basically women making an argument that they too deserve to be treated as equal. But the reason why I'm assigning you document number three is to highlight the inequalities that existed for women at this time period. Because when you think about it, rights are going to expand for certain groups. But meanwhile, right, certain groups, it did not. So if you look at some of the Declaration of Sentiment, the women, they list a series of grievances, a series of inequalities that they basically make an argument that they have been deprived, that their rights have been stripped of, and as a result, they are somewhat making an argument that they too deserve to be treated as equal. So not to give it away here, guys, but yeah, women, it's not going to be a good story for them, okay? Because again, their rights somewhat remain very limited itself. So number three, guys, it's about women. It's about women, their participation, their contribution, but also about the challenges that women still had to face, okay? So document number four, once again, another self-explanatory document, if you will. This one was written by Solomon Northup. I don't know how many of you have ever seen the film 12 Years a Slave, but the film itself is based on Solomon Northup's account. Solomon Northup was a slave from the north. Was a free man, was a free African-American man from the north. He was eventually kidnapped and ultimately sold into slavery. lived 12 years of his life under slavery. And here is where he describes what he sees, right, in the slave market. I believe this is in somewhat the nation's capital. It is a iconic and really captures that contradiction between American freedom and also slavery itself. Was that here was in the nation's capital, right? That America stood for freedom, democracy, and equality. Here you have a black man trapped in a cage, and all he can see out his somewhat window is the nation's capital. So what does that tell you in terms of somewhat the inconsistency when it comes to somewhat America, if you will? Okay, so document number 4, I am letting you know that you should start thinking about what life was like and also the experiences of more than 4.5 million slaves, okay, during this time period that we're focusing on, 1800 to 1860. Solomon Northup is a perspective of American history from the lens of the slaves themselves, right? So you have different accounts here, guys, right, from different perspectives and everything like that. All right, so document number 5. Document number 5 is a map, very simple map, self-explanatory. Document number 5 is to somewhat, to let you know that the Louisiana Purchase should be a part of your analysis. And how it should be a part of your analysis in this sense: when it comes to maps and documents and pictures, guys, do not waste your time to re-describe to me what my eyes can see from the map. Yes, I can see that it's a map of the Louisiana Purchase. I can see that the map itself highlights the expeditions that Jefferson somewhat sponsored. Yes, I can see all of that. But do you understand why this map is significant in terms of this time period and in terms of how it represents America as a nation of inconsistency? Okay, because you might want to think about the Louisiana Purchase, and you might want to think about who live out in the Louisiana Territory. Because once the American buy the Louisiana Territory from the French, they just assume that ultimately it's completely empty, that it's all for grabs, right? That is just a giant desert, okay? But the reality, we know better, that the Louisiana Territory itself was not a desert, right? The Louisiana Territory was populated by a lot of people. And as a result, this is where, guys, you might want to think about who was living out there, who will migrate out to that area, and how it's going to lead to somewhat conflict. So you might want to think about how this map and American expansion after the year 1803 is going to somewhat highlight that contradiction. That the Louisiana Purchase represents an opportunity for one group. Meanwhile, it is going to be detrimental for other groups. I will leave it at that, okay? That's what you need to do with this map, okay? Do not repeat that, oh, well, document number 5, we see a map of the Louisiana Purchase. Yes, I see that, okay? But you might want to think about how you can use this map to highlight, right, and to clarify and expand on Frederick Douglass's claim that America is a nation of inconsistency. Because again, in the real world, guys, and even in history, there are winners and there are losers. And oftentimes, those two are interconnected. The winners are winners because they are winning at the expense, because they are taking the resources, the material, the land, the labor from other groups for them to somewhat benefit. So I hope that's been clear to you. All right, so that's document number 5. Document number 6, speaking of somewhat expansion of rights, okay? Document number 6, what we see is an expansion of white male suffrage, meaning that it became easier to vote, especially if you were a white male. It's that simple, okay? And if you look at the markers here, okay, the yellows, right, or somewhat the greens, if you will, right, represent that in order for you to vote, you need to have property. That's why we call it property qualification, okay? If you look at somewhat that line, somewhat the stripe, somewhat color code, tax paying mean you have to pay a tax in order for you to vote. So you might want to think about, well, property and taxes as a requirement for to vote. Well, who would be eligible to vote? Okay. But if you look at the yellow, guys. Okay. White male suffrage without qualification. What it means is, in order for you to vote, all you had to be was two things, right? Male and white. That is it. So if you look at the progression of time, what does that say about the experiences of white men in America? Are they winners? Are they losers? Okay. What does that say? Okay. And document number 6 should not be used by itself. In order for you to properly use document number 6, you're going to have to correlate somewhat the content in document number 6 probably with document number 7. Because here's the reality, guys. Because on the one hand, from 1800 to 1860, you have the proliferation of democracy. You have the expansion of white male suffrage, meaning that it became easier for white men to vote and participate in politics. But at the same time, you also have the expansion of Cotton Kingdom, of slavery itself. Okay? How do we deal with that? That in a nation, right, where you have rights being expanded for white men, but at the same time, slavery was also expanding. On the eve of the American Revolution, there was around 500,000 slaves in America. By the end of the Civil War, there will be more than 4.5 million. I'm sorry, by the beginning of the Civil War, 4.5 million. So how do we account for that? That you have the expansion of white democracy, and you also have the expansion of Black enslavement. Maybe that is a theme that you might want to think about, right? In terms of why Douglass would claim that America is a nation of inconsistency. You have maps to show that, okay? And of course, 1860. This is a map of the election of 1860. You can clearly see the division within America along regional lines, along political lines. But the question you might want to ask yourself is, why? What created this division? And if you look at this map, it does show that America was a nation of inconsistency, because look at the divide, guys, right? North and South. How were they divided? Over what issue? Over what topic? And how does it relate to somewhat the idea that America is inconsistent, contradictory, right? So document number 8, you might want to think about the factors that led to somewhat the collapse of the two-party system, the Democrats and the Republicans. By 1860, they are clearly divided along regional lines, okay? But you might want to ask yourself, what does each party represent? The Republican Party by 1860, what do they represent? And the South, right, the Democrats, what do they represent by 1860? And once you square those two things out, you might want to match up and say, well, what does it say about America at the time? Okay, so those are the documents, guys, right? So I hope it's been clear. Now, just a warning in terms of the documents, okay? Number 1, do not re-describe to me what my eyes can see. Okay, don't waste your time, guys, because you are under a two-hour limit. I don't need you to re-describe a map. Okay, what I need you to do is quickly summarize, okay, what the map represents, and ultimately use the document, right, to answer the question. Okay, so this is where I said this is going to have to be part of your preparation. And here's rule number 2, all right, or something to avoid for in terms of the document. I am asking you to write me an essay, not document summaries, because I promise you, some of you are going to do this, and I will not give you partial credit for it, because I'm making it very clearly right now what my expectations are. What I do not want is 6 paragraphs with topic sentence that says document number 1 is this. Next paragraph, document number 2 is this. Next paragraph, document number 3 is this. and you're going to re-describe to me what the document is about. Okay? No, guys, those are document summaries. I don't need 6 document summaries. What I need from you is a cohesive, organized essay that uses the documents as your evidence, but it needs to correlate the documents. And also, guys, if you go down here, the key terms, all of them need to be part of your analysis. Think of it as kind of like a jigsaw puzzle that I'm asking you to do. The documents, those are the big pieces, okay? The key terms, those are your smaller pieces, but if you put it all together, right, it will help you tell a somewhat bigger picture. And that's what this essay is about, guys, okay? So what I want is a cohesive essay, introduction, thesis, right? Body paragraphs, topic sentence, evidence, right? That's where your documents come from. That's where your key terms come from. And ultimately in your body paragraph, analysis, correlating to me why the documents, why the key terms that you have used, how does it help you answer the question, right? Because remember, I'm asking you a question, okay? So for every document that you don't use below 6, it's a deduction of 20 points. So let's say you only use 5 documents and you use it effectively, okay? You're gonna get 20 points knocked off. 150 points minus 20 points, that's 130. Let's say you only use 4 documents, then again, 20, 20, that's 2 documents, that's 40 points you're gonna lose, etc. Okay? The key terms, yes, for every key term that you do not use, it's a minus 3 points. And it's a combined, right? So again, if you don't use a document, and let's say you don't use 5 key terms, okay? 5 times 3, that's 15 points. 1 document you don't use, that's 20 points. Add it all up, that's 35 points you're gonna lose. This is what I mean, guys. You got a lot of work to do, okay? So you wanna make sure you set aside as much time as possible to work on it, guys. Again, guys, write a cohesive essay. Because when I read your essay, it should not take me 2 to 3 times to read your essay to understand the point that you're trying to get at, okay? And I'm hoping that the sample document assignment has let you know what a good essay looks like and what a bad essay looks like. So you might wanna go back and look at your sample document, look at essay number 1, and look at essay number 3. Essay number 3, you do not want to use or emulate or do anything remotely close to that. But it is by far the worst essay out of the 3. Document number 1, essay number 1, that is somewhat what you should strive for. The details, the analysis, the organization, except guys, instead of 75 minutes, you have 2 hours. And instead of someone locking you in a gym like they do with those students, you get to work on this at home. You have 2 weeks to prepare. And then on top of that, you have my tutorial video as I have guided you in terms of what the test may be about, okay? So you got plenty somewhat of support, guys. So if you have any questions or anything like that, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, I have links down below here to help you analyze resources, how to properly cite, what the format is about. So I'm not gonna go over that, but I hope that this video has been clear to you in terms of what the assignment is about and ultimately what the themes and concept you will need to pay attention to. Again, think about Frederick Douglass's speech, okay? And his claim that America is a nation of inconsistency. And you might want to think about how does that claim holds up when we're looking at American history from the year 1800 to the year 1860. That's pretty much it, guys, right? So I hope that this video has been informative to you. And again, guys, do not re-describe to me what my eyes can see. And do not somewhat block quote from the sources, if you will, because again, you're under time limit. So it's waste of time for you to retype to me, right? What the documents already present to you. What you should try to do is try to summarize, okay? Summarize what each document is about in your own words, about 2 to 3 sentences each as part of your preparation. And what I would do is I would somewhat define the key terms on your own, and then as last part of my preparation, I will try to correlate which document and key terms will go together to help me tell a comprehensive story of those 4 groups that I am going to ask you to analyze. White men, white women, Native Americans, and slaves. I didn't pick those documents by accident, guys. I didn't pick those key terms by accident. I have a plan, I have a vision, and what I'm hoping is that you can put the pieces together. All right, guys? So best of luck. If you need any help, please feel free to reach out to me, but you want to set aside as much time as possible to work on this assignment. But on that, guys, best of luck. Do not forget 1,000 words for your essay, 6 out of the 8 documents, all of the key terms, okay? This assignment is worth 150 points. So it's quite a lot. So you want to make sure you do well on it, guys. All right, so I'm available if you need help. So please reach out to me as soon as possible. All right, guys, but best of luck. Thank you.